Dawn had walked this trail 100 times before, but nothing, not a single afternoon in her 7 years of life, had prepared her for the tiny German Shepherd puppy standing in the middle of the path, staring straight at her like it had been waiting. Every time she took a step forward, the puppy moved with her. Every time she stopped, it locked its dark, glassy eyes onto hers, shaking, pleading, refusing to look away. At first, she thought it was lost, just a frightened little stray looking for someone to follow home. Until the puppy started doing something she didn't expect, something that made her chest go tight and her feet go cold. Every whimper, every desperate little cry, it wasn't random noise. It was a message wrapped in fur and fear, begging to be understood. Then Dawn noticed something tied around its tiny neck. And her heart stopped. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. But when Dawn finally understood why this trembling creature had chosen her, of all people, on this ordinary afternoon, the truth broke her wide open. Stay with us, because this is one of those stories you will never forget. Welcome to our channel. Before we dive into this gripping mystery, rate this video from 1 to 10 based on how much you love real-life hero stories. Our team is on a mission to reach 1,000 subscribers this month, and every like, share, and subscription keeps these powerful stories coming straight to you every single day. Now, let's go back to that dusty trail. Dawn had not planned to be anyone's hero that afternoon. She was 7 years old, wearing her favorite pink outfit, the soft rose-colored set her grandmother had given her, and her only intention was to walk the winding dirt trail behind the neighborhood the way she did every Tuesday after school. The path curved gently through a stretch of open field before disappearing beneath a canopy of old oak trees, and Dawn knew every bend of it by heart. It was her trail. Safe, familiar, golden in the late afternoon light that filtered through the leaves like warm honey. She had barely rounded the first bend when she saw it. At first, she wasn't sure what she was looking at. Something small and dark was sitting perfectly still in the center of the path, right where the dirt track narrowed and the grass grew tall on either side. She slowed her steps, squinting. A bird, a large leaf blown down from the trees above. But then it moved. Tiny paws, tiny ears. A tiny black and tan body no bigger than her sneaker, trembling in a shaft of afternoon sunlight. Dawn stopped walking. The puppy stopped too. It was a German Shepherd. She could tell even at this age, even at this size, by the pointed ears and the black saddle markings across its back. But it was so small, so impossibly, heartbreakingly small, like something that had no business being out here alone, on a trail this far from any house, without a single human being in sight. Dawn crouched down slowly, the way her mother had taught her to approach animals, low and calm, no sudden movements. "Hey, little one," she whispered, "where did you come from?" She expected it to bolt. That's what lost animals did. They flinched, they ran, they made themselves invisible. But this puppy did none of those things. Instead, it took one careful step toward her, then another. Its tiny legs trembled with each step, but its eyes never wavered. Wide, dark, fixed entirely on Dawn's face with an intensity that felt far too serious for something so small. Dawn tilted her head. The puppy tilted its head. She almost smiled. Then she noticed it was shaking, not the playful, excited shaking of a puppy that wanted to be petted, but something rawer, deeper, the kind of trembling that came not from cold or excitement, but from the particular exhaustion of an animal that had been carrying something far too heavy for far too long. Dawn felt the smile fade from her face. She reached out her hand, fingers low, palm up. The puppy sniffed once, quick and businesslike, and then did something unexpected. It turned. It took 3 deliberate steps back down the trail in the direction of the tree line. Then it stopped and looked over its small shoulder, straight at Dawn. "Waiting." Dawn straightened up slowly. "You want me to follow you?" she murmured. The puppy let out a sound then, not a bark, not a playful yip, but a thin, aching whimper that seemed to travel straight up through Dawn's ribcage and squeeze something there. It was the saddest sound she had ever heard from a living thing. She took one step forward. The puppy turned immediately back toward the trees, its little tail curled low, its paws moving fast and urgent across the dirt. Dawn stood still, logic tugged at her. She was 7, the woods were deep, her mother would be expecting her home before the light faded. She turned to look back the way she had come, toward home, toward safety, toward the ordinary Tuesday afternoon she had planned. But behind her, that whimper came again, thinner this time, more desperate, like something fadding. Dawn turned back around. The puppy had stopped again at the edge of the path, where the grass swallowed the dirt and the shadows of the trees began to pool together. It stood there, ears forward, body still, except for the constant, trembling shiver that ran through it like a current it couldn't stop. And it was looking at her. Not the way a lost puppy looked at a stranger, not with confusion or fear or the simple animal hope for food and warmth. It was looking at her the way someone looked at the only person left in the world who could help them. Dawn swallowed. She didn't know it yet, couldn't have known, standing there in her pink sneakers on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday, but the direction that puppy was pointing was not deeper into the woods. It was toward the most important thing she would ever do in her entire life. She took a breath, and she followed. The tree line was closer than it looked. That was the thing about this particular stretch of trail, the way the woods seemed to hold themselves back politely until you were nearly upon them, and then suddenly you were standing at their edge with the open field already far behind you and the canopy pressing down overhead like a held breath. Dawn had crossed this threshold dozens of times without thinking twice, but she had always crossed it walking away from the trees, not toward them, and she had never crossed it following something. The puppy moved ahead of her in short, urgent bursts, 3 or 4 steps, then a pause, then a backward glance to confirm she was still there. It had a rhythm to it, almost like breathing. Advance, check, as if the little creature understood that it could not afford to move too fast and lose her, but also could not afford to slow down. Dawn kept her eyes on it and kept walking. But then the rational part of her brain, the part that sounded when it spoke, remarkably like her mother, began to reassert itself with every step she took away from the open trail. You don't know where it's going. You don't know these woods past the first bend. It's getting later. It's getting darker between the trees. She slowed without meaning to, her pink sneakers scuffing the dirt, her breath coming a little shorter. The puppy noticed immediately. It stopped, turned fully around, and stared at her with those enormous dark eyes that seemed, in the dimming afternoon light, to contain something almost unbearable inside them. Dawn stopped walking entirely. "I don't think I should go any further," she said aloud, as if saying it to the puppy made it more official, more decided. She took one step backward toward the open path, toward the sensible and ordinary world she understood. What happened next would stay with her for the rest of her life. The puppy did not bark. It did not growl or jump or chase her. It simply sank. That was the only word for it. It sank downward onto the dirt path, its tiny legs folding beneath it, its small chin dropping almost to the ground, and it let out a sound so raw and so ragged that Dawn's throat closed around a sudden, unexpected sob. It wasn't a whimper this time. It was something older than that. Something that didn't belong in a creature this small, a sound made of pure, exhausted grief, the sound of a living thing that had been trying with everything it had, and was terrified that everything it had was not going to be enough. Dawn stood frozen. The puppy lifted its chin from the dirt and looked at her, just looked. Its whole tiny body was trembling, not in short little shivers now, but in long, rolling waves, as though the effort of leading her this far had cost it something real, something it could not easily replace. The frayed scrap of cloth knotted around its neck fluttered faintly in the still air, and Dawn's eyes caught on it again the way they had back on the trail, ragged at the edges. Stained in a way she didn't yet have words for, not the kind of thing someone tied around a puppy's neck on purpose. The kind of thing tied in a hurry by someone who needed to send a message and had nothing else to send it with. And standing there, 7 years old, on the edge of a forest she only half knew, Dawn understood something she couldn't have articulated in that moment, but would spend years finding language for, that sometimes a plea doesn't need words. Sometimes it wears fur and stands in your path and refuses to let you choose comfort over conscience. Sometimes the bravest thing in the room is also the smallest thing in the room, and it chooses you not because you are strong, but because you are there, and because somewhere in your chest, beneath all the ordinary fear, there is something that recognizes another soul in distress. She stopped moving backward. She looked at the puppy. The puppy looked at her. And Dawn took one step forward, then another, back toward the trees, back toward the thing the puppy so desperately needed her to find. Because turning away from that sound, from those eyes, from that shaking little body, would have required becoming someone she did not want to be. Some choices aren't really choices at all. The puppy didn't run ahead this time. Instead, it waited, stood right there in the middle of the path with its small chest rising and falling in quick, shallow movements, watching Dawn close the distance between them with something that looked, in the slanted afternoon light, almost like relief, as if it had spent every ounce of its remaining energy on that single devastating moment of collapse, and now that she had chosen to come back, it could afford to breathe again. Just barely, just enough. Dawn knelt down in the dirt in front of it, her knees pressing into the cool, packed earth the way they did when she was examining something she needed to understand completely. She was close enough now to see the details she had only glimpsed from a distance, the faint tan markings above its eyes that made it look perpetually worried, the way its ears, still too large for its head, swiveled forward as she leaned in. Up close, the puppy was even smaller than it had seemed from a standing height. She could have cupped it in both palms. The thought made something in her chest ache. But it was the cloth around its neck that pulled her attention and held it. She had noticed it before, back on the open trail when the puppy first turned to lead her, but she had only registered it as a detail, the way you notice a smudge on a window without stopping to examine it. Now, crouched here at eye level with the tiny animal, she looked at it properly for the first time. And the more she looked, the more the ordinary afternoon around her seemed to quietly drain of its warmth. It wasn't a collar. She knew what collars looked like. Her neighbor had a beagle named Butterscotch who wore a bright red one with a little silver bone charm. This was nothing like that. This was a strip of fabric, once cream-colored by the look of the parts that had escaped the worst of it, now twisted and knotted at the side of the puppy's neck in a loop that was tight enough to hold but rough enough that it had clearly not been fashioned with care or time. The edges were torn, not cut. She could see the individual threads splaying outward where the fabric had been ripped free from something larger. A shirt, maybe, or a bag, something that had been whole until it wasn't. Dawn reached out slowly, and the puppy held perfectly still as her fingers grazed the fabric. It was stiff in places, stiff in a way that cloth got when something wet dried into it and wasn't washed out. Her fingertips moved along the edge of a dark patch near the knot, and the texture of it, rough and slightly raised, like dried paint, but heavier, made her pull her hand back without entirely meaning to. She sat with that for a moment. She was 7, and there were things she hadn't yet been taught in any classroom, and certain realities that adults tended to keep at a careful remove from children her age. But she was also a child who paid attention, who noticed things, who had once found an injured bird in the yard and known before her mother said a word that it was in serious trouble. She had that quality, the ability to read a situation through its physical details the way other people read words on a page. And the physical details in front of her right now were writing something she couldn't ignore. The cloth had been torn from something in a hurry, knotted by hands that were either shaking or rushing, possibly both. Whatever had stained it had soaked in deep enough to change the texture of the weave, and it had been tied around this puppy's neck not as an accessory, not as a game, but as an act of desperate communication, by someone who needed to send a signal outward into the world and had no other way to do it. No phone to call for help, no voice that could carry far enough. Only this, a scrap of fabric and a puppy small enough to slip through the brush, and the fragile, enormous hope that the puppy would find someone who would stop long enough to look. Dawn sat back on her heels and let the full weight of that understanding settle over her. Somewhere in these woods, someone had been hurt. Someone had had just enough left in them, just enough clarity, just enough will to tear strip from their own clothing, knot it around the neck of a creature barely old enough to walk straight, and send it out like a paper boat on a river, trusting the current to carry it to shore. That person had no guarantee Dawn would come along, no guarantee anyone would. They had acted on pure, desperate faith, the kind that doesn't calculate odds because it cannot afford to. The puppy nudged her knee with its nose. Soft, insistent, a gentle but unmistakable reminder that there was no more time for sitting and processing, that the understanding she had just arrived at was not a destination, but a starting point. Dawn stood up. She looked down at the small creature at her feet, its stained signal, its trembling urgency, its eyes that asked more of her than anyone ever had. She had learned something important, kneeling there in the dirt, something that had nothing to do with woods or puppies or torn cloth. She had learned that a cry for help does not always arrive in a form you recognize, that sometimes it comes wrapped in something small and wordless, delivered to your feet not by accident, but by the last reserves of someone's will to survive. And the question it asks is not whether you are brave enough or strong enough or old enough to respond. The question it asks is simply whether you are paying attention. Dawn had been paying attention. She pressed forward into the shadows, and the puppy led the way. The woods had a different quality of silence than the open trail. Out on the path, silence was simply the absence of noise, birdsong gone quiet, wind taking a breath, the world between sounds. But in here, beneath the interlocking canopy of oak and elm that filtered the afternoon sun down to thin, wandering threads of gold, the silence had texture. It pressed softly against Dawn's eardrums like the silence inside a seashell, full of something she couldn't quite identify. Not threatening, exactly, but aware. The way a room feels aware when you enter it and realize, a half-second too late, that it was not as empty as it looked. Dawn stayed close to the puppy. The path, if it could still be called that, had narrowed considerably from the wide dirt trail she knew. It was more suggestion than road now, a faint parting in the undergrowth where feet had passed often enough to discourage the grass, but not often enough to leave anything permanent. Branches reached in from either side at shoulder height, and the ground had gone softer, darker, threaded with exposed roots that required attention to navigate. Dawn watched her feet, then watched the puppy, then watched the shadows between the trees ahead, then started the whole rotation again. She almost missed it when the puppy stopped. It had pulled ahead by a few feet, moving with more confidence now that she was committed to following, the hesitant stop-and-check rhythm finally abandoned, and it stopped so abruptly that its back paws skidded slightly on a patch of damp leaves. Dawn drew up short behind it, heart lurching. But it wasn't danger that had stopped the puppy, not directly. It turned and came back toward her, and this time it didn't stop at her feet. It closed the distance entirely and took the hem of Dawn's pink dress gently but firmly between its small teeth. The fabric pulled taut. The puppy tugged, once deliberate, insistent, then released and moved 2 steps to the left, off the faint suggestion of path and into the denser brush where the undergrowth thickened and the light dropped another degree. Dawn looked where it was pointing her. The brush was heavy there, tangled, uninviting, not the kind of place you went without a reason. She looked back at the puppy. It tugged her hem again. There was something about that gesture, the gentleness of it, the deliberateness, the fact that it pulled and then waited rather than simply bolting ahead and expecting her to follow, that undid the last thread of Dawn's resistance. This was not random animal behavior. This was communication. Careful, considered, unmistakably intentional communication from a creature that had no human words, but was deploying every tool available to it with a focus and intelligence that made Dawn feel, suddenly and strangely, that she was the less capable one in this partnership. She stepped off the path. The brush closed around her ankles immediately, dry stems and low branches catching at her clothes, the ground uneven and soft in ways that her sneakers weren't designed for. She pushed through with her arms, the puppy threading ahead of her through gaps she had to force open, and within a dozen steps, the faint path had vanished entirely behind her, and she was genuinely, fully inside the woods in a way she had never been before. The canopy here was denser, and the amber afternoon light barely reached the floor, pooling instead in pale, scattered coins across the dark earth. She should have been more frightened than she was. Later, much later, sitting in a warm kitchen with a mug of hot chocolate going cold beside her because she kept forgetting to drink it, still trying to put language to the afternoon, she would think about this. About the fact that at every point in this walk, from the moment the puppy first appeared on the trail to this moment pushing through dense brush far off any marked path, something inside her had known. Not known the specifics, not known what was waiting or how bad it was or how little time remained, but known in the broader, more fundamental sense, known that this mattered, known that turning away would be a kind of wound that wouldn't close cleanly, known, in the wordless way that the body sometimes knows things the brain hasn't caught up to yet, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had almost talked herself out of that knowledge twice. Once at the tree line, when logic had tugged her backward like a hand on her shoulder, and once in the moment before she crouched to examine the cloth, when some comfortable, self-protective instinct had urged her to simply keep walking, keep a careful distance, not look too closely at the things that might require something from her. Both times something had overruled that instinct. Both times she had listened to the quieter, less comfortable voice, the one that said this is wrong, something is wrong, you already know it is, rather than the louder one promising her that everything was probably fine and home was warm and dinner was waiting. That is the thing about intuition that nobody tells you when you are 7 years old or 17 or 40. It doesn't arrive with fanfare. It doesn't announce itself in bold or speak in complete sentences. It arrives quietly, the way this puppy had arrived, small and easy to overlook, easy to dismiss as nothing, easy to step around and forget on your way to somewhere more comfortable. It asks nothing of you except your attention. And when you give it your attention, when you crouch down and really look, when you follow the hem tug off the safe path and into the uncertain dark, it leads you to the things that matter most. Dawn had almost ignored it, almost let the noise of her own fear drown it out entirely. Here's a question for you, and we genuinely want to know. Have you ever had a gut feeling you ignored and later wished you hadn't? Drop your answer in the comments right now. And while you're there, if this story is pulling at something in your chest, please hit subscribe and join our growing family. We are so close to 1,000 subscribers this month, and every single one of you helps us keep bringing these stories to the people who need to hear them. Now back to the woods, where the puppy is about to show Dawn something that will stop her cold. Ahead of her, the puppy had stopped again at the edge of a small natural clearing where a fallen log lay half buried in ivy and moss. It wasn't looking at the log. It was looking at the ground just beyond it, ears forward, body rigid, the trembling current moving through it again. And Dawn, pushing through the last curtain of brush to stand beside it in the clearing's thin light, looked at the ground too. She saw something glint. Small, metallic, half hidden in the dark earth and leaves, as though it had landed there with force and been forgotten. The puppy looked up at her. Dawn's mouth had gone dry. She took a step closer. The glint was small enough to miss entirely. That was the first thing Dawn thought, standing at the edge of the clearing with the puppy rigid and trembling at her side. If she had arrived here any differently, moving faster, looking elsewhere, coming at the clearing from a different angle, her eyes would have slid right over it. The forest floor was not empty of small, hard objects. There were stones here, bits of bark with mica threaded through them, the occasional piece of broken glass from some forgotten bottle that had wandered far from any road. The eye learned to discount these things. The eye learned, in places like this, to accept a certain amount of ordinary glinting as part of the landscape's natural vocabulary. But this was different, and some part of her knew it before the rest of her caught up. She moved toward it slowly, crouching as she went, her knees meeting the cold ground at the base of the fallen log where the ivy grew thick and undisturbed. The puppy moved with her, pressed so close to her left side that she could feel its warmth against her arm, its breathing rapid and shallow, its entire small body vibrating with a tension that transferred itself through the air between them and settled in Dawn's own chest like a second heartbeat. She reached out and parted the ivy with 2 careful fingers. It was a zipper pull, not attached to anything, not lying neatly as though someone had set it down. It was half-driven into the soft earth at an angle that suggested it had arrived here with speed, with force, the way small objects arrived at the end of a struggle rather than the end of an ordinary walk. It was the kind of zipper pull found on the outer pocket of a backpack or a jacket, a sturdy rectangular piece of brushed silver metal with a small loop at one end where the zipper tab had connected, and at the other end a clean, sharp break, not worn through, not rusted apart over time. Snapped. Recently, given the brightness of the broken edge, which had none of the dullness that came with exposure to air and moisture over days or weeks. Dawn picked it up. It was heavier than she expected something so small to be, and cold in a way that went beyond the temperature of the ground it had been lying in. She turned it over in her palm. On its flat face, barely visible but unmistakably present, was a tiny engraved pattern, a small leaf, the kind of decorative detail added to make an ordinary object personal, specific, belonging to someone in particular rather than to anyone in general. Someone had carried this, had chosen this bag or this jacket partly because of this small engraved leaf, had handled this zipper pull hundreds of times, opening and closing a pocket without thinking about it, the way you handle the things that belong to you without cataloging them because you assume they will always be there. It was not always there anymore. Dawn closed her fingers around it and stood up. The puppy, who had been holding itself in a kind of controlled stillness while she examined the pull, came suddenly and completely undone. There was no other way to describe what happened next. The discipline that had characterized its behavior since the moment it appeared on the trail, the purposeful movement, the measured pauses, the careful communication, cracked open, and what came through the crack was pure, unfiltered animal desperation of a kind that hit Dawn like a wall. The puppy barked, not the exploratory single bark of a dog reacting to a sound, but rapid, urgent, insistent barking that bounced off the trees and came back at them from multiple directions at once, filling the clearing with a sound far larger than the creature making it. Between barks it whined, high and fraying, and it moved in tight, frantic circles around Dawn's feet before breaking away to the far edge of the clearing, then circling back, then breaking away again, a pattern of movement that communicated, with devastating clarity, that there was somewhere specific it needed her to go, and the time for patience had run out entirely. Dawn's own pulse spiked in immediate response. The body did not wait for the brain in moments like this. It simply responded to the frequency of distress broadcasting from the animal beside her and matched it, adrenaline arriving cold and clarifying in her bloodstream before she had consciously processed a single thought. "Okay," she breathed. "Okay, I'm coming, show me." The puppy didn't wait for her to finish the sentence. It shot across the clearing and plunged into the undergrowth on the far side, and Dawn ran after it, actually ran, crashing through brush, branches whipping at her arms and face, her sneakers slipping on patches of wet leaves and finding purchase again, and she realized as she ran that she was no longer frightened of the woods the way she had been frightened standing at their edge 15 minutes ago. The fear had not disappeared. It was still fully present, a live current running beneath everything, sharpening her senses and pushing oxygen into her legs. But it had changed in character. It was no longer fear of the dark and the unfamiliar and the unknown. It had become something more specific, more directed, something with a face, almost, or rather, the fear of a face she hadn't seen yet. The face belonging to whoever had carried this small silver pull engraved with a leaf, and had their pocket torn from their body in a place where no one walked and no one would think to look. That fear was worse in some ways. But it was also the kind of fear you could move through because it was the kind of fear attached to a purpose. She was not running from something, she was running towards someone, and that distinction she was discovering at 7 years old in a forest at dusk made all the difference between freezing and moving. Between turning back and pressing forward into the darkening air, the zipper pull clenched in her small fist. The puppy's frantic motion, a bright thread of urgency, pulling her through the trees toward whatever truth was waiting on the other side of the next tangle of branches. The puppy barked again, sharp and close, just ahead. Dawn pushed through the last curtain of brush and stumbled into the open. What she saw made her stop breathing entirely. It was not a body. That was the first thing Dawn's mind registered, in the half-second between stumbling through the brush and her lungs remembering how to work. Not a body, not the worst thing, just an object, a torn, destroyed, utterly wrecked object lying at the base of a thick-trunked oak tree, the far edge of a small natural depression in the forest floor, surrounded by disturbed earth and scattered debris that told a story Dawn was only just beginning to have the vocabulary to read. She stood still and breathed. The puppy was already at the tree, nosing urgently at the wreckage, circling it with that feverish energy that had not dimmed since the clearing. But Dawn stayed where she was for a moment longer, because something in the scene required her full attention before she moved through it, the way you paused at the threshold of a room where something serious had happened, compelled by some instinct to take it in whole before the details began to separate themselves and demand individual reckoning. What she was looking at had once been a bag. A purse, a real one, not a child's toy version or a cheap fabric tote, but the kind of structured, grown woman bag that Dawn associated with her mother leaving for work in the mornings. It was brown leather, or had been. Now it was barely recognizable as a single object. The main body had been wrenched apart at the seams with a force that had split the stitching clean rather than unraveling it, the leather itself torn in two places along the side panel, the kind of tearing that did not happen when a bag was dropped or lost or left behind. The kind that happened when it was pulled, hard, in two different directions at once by two different forces. One of the straps was still attached, shortened now to a few inches of leather ending in a ragged, stretched-out curl. The other strap was simply gone, separated entirely from the body of the bag and absent from the scene, carried away or discarded somewhere Dawn couldn't see. The contents were everywhere. Not neatly, not the way things scattered when a bag was set down carelessly and tipped over. They were distributed across the ground in a radius that spoke of sudden, violent dispersal. Lip balm, with its cap missing lying 3 feet from the bag's body. A small folded piece of paper pressed into the damp earth with a boot print across it. A handful of coins half buried in the disturbed soil as though they had been driven into it rather than dropped onto it. A single key on a plain ring had landed in the crook of an exposed tree root and sat there still, undisturbed, catching the thin light that filtered down through the canopy with a brightness that felt almost indecent given its surroundings. Ordinary objects, every one of them. The kind of objects that lived at the bottom of every bag, carried by every person going about the routine business of an ordinary day, invisible in their ordinariness, until the day they were suddenly visible in all the wrong ways. Dawn moved forward slowly, stepping around rather than through the scattered items, her eyes moving from object to object with the careful, reluctant attention of someone who understood, somewhere below conscious thought, that what they were looking at was evidence, not of carelessness, not of accident, of interruption. Someone's day had been interrupted here, stopped mid-sentence, mid-thought, mid-reach into a bag for a key or a phone or a piece of lip balm. Everything this person had carried with them through the ordinary architecture of their life had been thrown outward from them in an instant, and the person themselves. Dawn stopped. She crouched beside the bag's ruined body and looked at it up close, the way she had looked at the cloth around the puppy's neck. The leather had a smell rich and dark and underlaid with something else she couldn't name, something sharp and faintly metallic that made her nostrils flare and her stomach turn over once, lightly, in warning. The torn edges of the side panel were stiff, like the cloth had been stiff. Darkened in the same irregular, patchy way that the cloth had been darkened, the leather having absorbed something that had then dried into its grain and would not come out. Her hand hovered over it without touching. The puppy made a low, continuous sound beside her, not quite a whimper, not quite a growl, something in the register between the two that she had not heard from it before. A sound of sustained, grieving distress. The sound of an animal sitting inside a loss it could not articulate and could not resolve and could not stop feeling. Dawn looked at it. Its eyes were fixed on the bag with an expression she had no framework for seeing on an animal's face and yet could not misread. Recognition, grief. The particular anguish of a creature that knew the smell of this object from 1,000 safe, ordinary days when it meant warmth and home, and the person it loved most arriving or departing, and now encountered it here, like this, meaning something she could not explain to it, and it could not explain to her, but both of them understood completely. This bag belonged to someone the puppy loved, and the puppy had last seen that person here, or near here, in circumstances that had scattered her belongings across the forest floor and left a small, desperate animal as the only witness and the only hope of raising an alarm. Dawn sat back on her heels, the zipper pulled still in her closed fist, and she thought about the systems that were supposed to prevent this. The unspoken agreement that the world made with people going about their days, that paths were safe, that ordinary afternoons unfolded ordinarily, that a woman walking through a green afternoon with her puppy and her brown leather purse would arrive home again and empty her pockets and put the kettle on and close the door against the evening. The process of being safe in the world that everyone operated inside of without examining, because examining it too closely required confronting how fragile it actually was. That process had broken here, broken violently, completely, without warning. And the evidence of its breaking was distributed across 10 feet of dark forest floor, and nobody in the world knew about it except a 7-year-old girl in a pink dress and the tiny, trembling animal who had chosen her. The weight of that settled on Dawn's chest with a gravity disproportionate to her size and her years. She was not old enough to carry this, and yet she was the one who was here, which meant she was, by the simple and non-negotiable logic of circumstances, exactly old enough. She stood up. She looked at the puppy. "Where is she?" Dawn asked. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. The puppy lifted its head from the devastated bag, looked at her with those deep, exhausted, unflinching eyes, then turned its nose toward the densest part of the shadows ahead, where the trees crowded closest together and the ground sloped away downward into a depression she couldn't yet see the bottom of, and whimpered. Once, low and certain, and full of everything words could never hold. The slope was deceptive. From where Dawn stood beside the ruined bag, the ground ahead simply looked darker, a deepening of shadow between the trees that her eyes interpreted as distance rather than descent. But when she followed the puppy forward and her leading foot found nothing solid where she expected solid to be, her stomach lurched, and she grabbed at a branch beside her, catching herself before the slope took her down on her knees. The ground dropped away at a sharper angle than it had appeared, the earth soft and crumbling at the edge, threaded with roots that served as uneven steps if you were careful and as trip hazards if you weren't. Dawn was careful. She had become very careful in the last several minutes. The forest had taught her that. She picked her way down the embankment sideways, one hand trailing against the rough bark of a tree trunk for balance, her eyes adjusting slowly to the deeper shadow in the depression below. The puppy had already reached the bottom and was moving in tight, anxious circles on the flat ground there, its claws leaving small, frantic half-moons in the soft earth. It kept looking up at her, and then away, up and then away, the look of a creature that needed her to hurry but was trying very hard not to overwhelm her into stillness again. Her foot found flat ground. She straightened up and looked around the depression. It was perhaps 15 feet across, bowl-shaped, the kind of natural hollow that collected fallen leaves and pooled rainwater and stayed damp long after the rest of the forest had dried out. It smelled of wet earth and something older, decomposing bark, cold stone, the particular mineral sharpness of ground that rarely saw direct sun. The light here was the thinnest it had been since she entered the woods, arriving only as a pale, diffuse glow that turned everything to shades of gray and deep green. And there, half buried under a scatter of wet leaves against the far slope of the hollow, was the phone. Or what was left of it. Dawn crossed to it without the puppy having to guide her this time. Her feet found it on their own, drawn by that same instinct that had been operating beneath the surface of her conscious mind since the trail, the instinct that recognized significance before her brain had finished formulating the thought. She crouched and lifted it from the leaves with both hands, the way you lifted something that needed to be treated with respect. The screen was shattered comprehensively. not cracked in the spiderweb pattern of a phone dropped face down on a hard floor. That kind of damage had a center, a point of impact from which the fractures radiated outward in diminishing lines. This was different. The screen had been destroyed across its entire surface in a pattern that suggested it had struck something, or something had struck it, with enough force to collapse the glass rather than simply crack it. Several fragments were missing entirely from the lower corner, leaving a gap of exposed internals that glinted faintly in the dim light. The case, a soft one, pale in color, though the dirt made it difficult to say exactly what color it had been, was separated from the phone body along one edge, bent back at an angle that should not have been possible given how snugly such cases fit. Dawn's thumb found the side button without thinking and pressed it. She expected nothing. She expected the black, unreflective nothing of a dead battery or a destroyed screen, the phone reduced by whatever had happened here to an expensive piece of inert material incapable of communicating anything further. Instead, the screen flickered. The cracks caught the sudden light and scattered it in a dozen directions at once, and the image that assembled itself through the fractured glass was incomplete, interrupted by dark lines and missing patches where the display had given out entirely. But enough of it survived. Enough came through the broken surface to reach Dawn's eyes with absolute, unmistakable clarity. A woman. Young, not elderly, not middle-aged, but young in the way Dawn's older cousins were young, somewhere in the territory of early adulthood where people still looked like slightly taller versions of the children they had recently been. She was laughing in the photo, her head tilted back, her eyes creased nearly shut with the particular abandon of genuine rather than performed joy. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and the light in the image was warm, golden, outdoor light, the kind of light this forest might produce on a better afternoon than this one. And in her arms, pressed against her chest, with the casual ownership of an animal completely certain of its welcome, was the puppy. Smaller in the photo, younger, softer in the face, the ears not yet fully committed to their upright position, but unmistakably the same creature now standing at Dawn's feet, looking up at the shattered screen with an expression that made Dawn's throat close entirely, because the puppy recognized it. That was the thing that undid her, standing in that cold hollow with the broken phone glowing in her hands. The puppy was looking at that image the way you looked at something precious and vanished, with a grief so uncomplicated by self-consciousness or defense that it arrived in Dawn's chest like a blade. This was not a lost dog. This was a dog that knew exactly where its person was and exactly what condition that person was in, and had spent every ounce of its small, fierce loyalty finding a way to communicate that to a world that did not speak its language. It had no words. It had no phone to call for help, no way to write down coordinates, no mechanism for making itself understood by the large, complicated, language-dependent creatures who moved through this forest on two legs and required everything to be explained to them slowly. It had only its presence, its persistence, the frayed cloth and the silver pull and the wrecked bag, and now this shattered screen held up in a 7-year-old's hands like a last piece of evidence submitted to a jury of one, every object a sentence. Every desperate, chosen behavior paragraph in a testimony it had been delivering since the moment it found Dawn on the trail, trusting, with a faith that had no rational basis, except the faith of a loyal creature that has not yet learned to stop believing, that if it just kept showing her, kept leading her, kept pressing its small warmth against her knee and her hem and her doubt, she would eventually understand. She understood. Loyalty, real loyalty, does not calculate the odds before it acts. It does not weigh the risk or measure the reward or ask whether the effort will be recognized. It simply moves toward the thing it loves and toward the person most likely to help. This puppy had no guarantee that Dawn would follow. No guarantee that a 7-year-old girl would be able to do what a grown adult with resources and reach could barely manage. It chose her anyway and kept choosing her, one small persistent step at a time. That is the full definition of loyalty, the decision, made and remade again, to show up, wordlessly, completely, regardless of outcome. If this story is speaking to something in you, Please subscribe right now and join the family that shows up for these stories every day. We are almost at 1,000 subscribers, and every single person who clicks that button is choosing the way this puppy chose to show up. Like the video. Share it with someone who needs to hear this today. And drop in the comments, has an animal ever shown you a loyalty that left you speechless? We genuinely want to know. Now come back, because Dawn is still standing in that hollow, phone in hand, and the puppy is already moving again. And what is waiting just beyond the next rise of ground is something that will demand every last piece of courage she has. Dawn lowered the phone slowly. She looked at the woman's laughing face one more time through the fractured glass, at the warmth in it, at the life in it, at the complete absence from it of any knowledge of what was coming. And then she looked at the puppy, who had already turned away from the image and was facing the far edge of the hollow where the ground rose again toward a dense wall of shadow. She slipped the phone carefully into the front pocket of her pink top against her chest. It felt important not to leave it here. It felt important to carry it the way the puppy had carried the message of that cloth around its neck, as proof, as testimony, as the record of a person who existed and mattered and was somewhere in these woods right now, needing the world to remember that. "I've got her," Dawn said quietly to the puppy, to the woman in the photograph, to herself. The puppy pressed forward into the shadow, and Dawn climbed. The other side of the hollow gave way to nothing. That was the only word for it, nothing. No obvious path, no glinting objects catching what remained of the light, no disrupted earth telling the story of a passage forced through its speed. The ground leveled out from the climb and spread itself into a wide, flat area where the trees stood farther apart than they had anywhere else in the woods, their canopy thinning overhead to reveal a pale strip of late afternoon sky going the color of weak tea at its edges. It was almost a clearing, almost open. And it was utterly, completely, disquietingly still. Dawn stood at its center and turned slowly in a full circle. The puppy was casting. That was the word that would come to her later, the word she'd learned from a nature documentary watched on a rainy afternoon when she was 10, the word for what a tracking dog did when the scent it was following thinned and broke apart, and the animal moved in widening arcs trying to find the thread again. It moved in urgent half-circles across the clearing floor, nose dropping to the ground, then lifting, then dropping again, its whole body angled forward with a focus so intense it was almost visible, like heat rising from summer pavement. But the circles were becoming wider, slower, less certain. The trail had gone cold. Dawn hugged her own arms against her chest, her fingers pressing against the hard rectangle of the broken phone through the fabric of her top, a habit she had already developed in the last 10 minutes, checking, periodically, that it was still there, as though the phone were the anchor, as though losing it would mean losing the proof that the woman in the photograph was real, and the afternoon was real, and the thing she was doing here, alone in a forest at the thickening edge of evening, actually mattered. The light was changing. This was what frightened her more than the silence, more than the cold that had begun to seep up from the ground through the thin soles of her sneakers and settle in her ankles. The light had been doing something manageable until now, low, amber, thin through the canopy but present, enough to see by, enough to feel that the day still had time left in it. But in the last few minutes, since they had climbed out of the hollow, it had shifted into something qualitatively different. Not dark yet, but preparing to be. The particular blue-gray cast that preceded actual darkness by 20 minutes, that brief atmospheric warning the sky issued before it stopped negotiating and committed fully to night. 20 minutes was not very long. Dawn turned another slow circle, and this time she let herself feel the fear she had been managing at arm's length since she stepped off the trail. She let it arrive in full, the awareness of how far from the path she was, how completely she had surrendered her bearings in the chase through the brush, how nobody knew where she was and nobody was coming, and the woods were large and indifferent and utterly incapable of caring whether she found her way out of them before the light went. She let it arrive, and she felt it, and she did not look away from it, because she had learned in the last hour that the things you refused to look at directly were the things that tripped you. Then she set it aside, not dismissed, set aside, filed in the category of things that were true and real and would require dealing with, but not yet, not this minute, not until she had done the thing she was here to do. She looked at the puppy. It had stopped moving. That was what reached her first, the cessation of movement rather than any new movement. The puppy was standing at the far edge of the clearing with its back to her, completely still in a way it had not been still since the trail, and for one terrible, untethered moment Dawn thought something was wrong with it, that the effort and the distress had finally overwhelmed its small body, that it had simply stopped the way a wound-down clock stopped. It lifted its nose to the air. One breath, too, held perfectly motionless while it read whatever language the evening air was carrying through the trees from somewhere ahead, assembling information from molecules Dawn's senses were nowhere near equipped to access. She watched it process. She watched its small frame absorb what it was receiving and metabolize it into certainty. Then it barked. Not the frantic, sustained barking of the clearing near the zipper pull. This was different, single, sharp, enormous for the size of the animal producing it, a sound that went up through the canopy and out into the gray sky above like a flare. And then again. And then a third time, each bark aimed with surgical precision at a specific point in the tree line at the clearing's northeast edge, a place where two large trunks grew close together, and the shadows between them ran deeper than the shadows on either side. Dawn's heart seized and then restarted. She crossed the clearing at a run. The puppy met her halfway, falling into step beside her, with the urgency returned in full force now, the cold trail uncertainty entirely gone, replaced by the vibrating, focused certainty of an animal that had relocated its bearing and was not going to lose it again. It moved faster than it had moved all afternoon, pushing the edge of what its small legs could manage on the uneven ground, and Dawn matched its stride for stride, her breath coming in short, visible puffs in the cooling air. She thought about the silence as she ran, about how it had felt standing in the center of that clearing with the trail gone cold and the light failing and the puppy casting in diminishing circles, that particular quality of despair that arrived not with noise or drama, but with quietness, with the absence of forward motion, with the sense of a door closing. She had stood inside that silence for perhaps 3 full minutes, and 3 minutes did not sound like very long until you were 7 years old in a darkening forest, with someone's life in the balance and nothing to show you the way forward. 3 minutes could feel like a decision, like the universe pausing to determine whether you had really meant it when you promised you weren't leaving. She had meant it. And the puppy, this extraordinary, impossible, heartbreaking creature who had carried more than any animal its size and age should ever have been required to carry, had found the thread again, had lifted its nose and read the air, and barked them both back from the edge of the silence into forward motion, into direction, into the particular fierce aliveness of moving toward something rather than standing still. Later, much later, in the way that this afternoon would spend years revealing itself to her in layers, Dawn would understand that this was the moment that mattered most, not the finding, not the rescue which was still ahead of them and would arrive with its own weight, but this, the silent clearing and the choice to stay inside it rather than turn back, the 3 minutes of nothing and the decision made somewhere below the level of words to trust, to wait out the quiet rather than flee it. To believe that the thread was still there even when she couldn't see it. The puppy barked again, just ahead now, just beyond the 2 close-standing trunks, and Dawn pushed between them into the shadows. And stopped. The ground sloped sharply downward before her into a narrow embankment thick with tangled undergrowth, and at its base, half concealed beneath the enormous horizontal trunk of a fallen tree that lay across the depression like a bar across a door, she could see something that the failing light and the undergrowth conspired to conceal, but could not conceal entirely from eyes that had been trained by the last hour to look past concealment and find the truth beneath it. A hand. Pale, still, the fingers slightly curled against the dark earth, the way fingers curled in sleep or in pain or in the aftermath of a struggle that had finally exhausted itself into stillness. Dawn's breath left her body entirely. The puppy was already down the embankment, sliding and scrambling on the loose earth, making sounds now that had no category in Dawn's prior experience, sounds of relief and terror and love braided together into something that bypassed her brain and reached directly into the oldest, most human part of her. She reached into her pocket with shaking fingers and pulled out the shattered phone. The screen flickered on. 3% battery. She pressed the emergency call button and put it to her ear and opened her mouth and said, in a voice that came out smaller than she intended but carried everything that mattered, "I need help. I'm in the woods behind the Greyfield Trail and I found someone and I think she's really hurt and please, please hurry." The dispatcher's voice came back through the broken screen, calm and immediate and real. And Dawn sank to her knees at the top of the embankment, the phone pressed to her ear, watching the puppy press its small warm body against the pail, still hand below, pressing and pressing, as though warmth was something that could be transferred by contact, by proximity, by the sheer refusal of a loyal creature to stop offering everything it had. The embankment was steeper up close than it had looked from between the trees. Dawn stood at its lip, with the dispatcher's voice still moving in her ear, calm, professional, asking her questions. She was doing her best to answer accurately, and looked down at the 12 or 15 feet of crumbling, root-threaded slope that separated her from the hollow below. The fallen tree trunk lay across the depression at the bottom like something placed there deliberately, a massive oak that had come down at an angle, its root ball torn from the earth somewhere uphill, and now a dark, looming wall of exposed wood at the far end, its trunk perhaps 3 feet in diameter where it crossed the lowest point of the hollow. Beneath it, in the compressed shadow between the trunk's underside and the ground, was where the puppy had gone, was where the hand was. "Can you tell me if the person is conscious?" the dispatcher asked. I can't see yet," Dawn said. "I'm at the top, I have to go down." "Okay, can you do that safely?" She was already doing it, not because she had decided to, exactly, but because her body had made the decision while her brain was still formulating the question. Her hands found a root to grip, her feet found a narrow ledge of compacted earth, and she descended the embankment the way she had learned to descend the big climbing frame at school, methodically, testing each point of contact before committing weight to it, moving down in stages rather than in one continuous motion that the loose earth would have turned immediately into a slide. She reached the bottom and straightened up. The puppy was pressed against the pale hand, exactly as she had seen from above, its small body tucked close to the wrist and forearm that extended from beneath the trunk's shadow. It looked up at her when she landed. Just once, briefly, the look of an animal confirming that the help it had summoned had actually arrived, and then back down at the hand, and it made that sound again, the one with no clean category, the braided grief and love and relief sound that did things to the inside of Dawn's chest she did not have words for. She moved closer. "I'm at the bottom now," she told the dispatcher. "I can see her." What she could see, in the thin and failing light beneath the trunk's overhang, was a woman lying on her side in the compressed earth of the hollow floor. Her back was against the slope of the embankment, her body partially wedged beneath the fallen trunk, one arm extended, the arm whose hand Dawn had seen from above, and the other folded beneath her at an angle that looked deeply uncomfortable. She was wearing a dark jacket, torn along the shoulder seam, and her hair was loose and tangled with leaves and earth. She was pale in the way that people were pale when their body had spent a long time directing all available resources inward, away from the surface, not the pallor of peacetime, the pallor of a body in the serious business of keeping itself alive. Her chest was moving. Dawn saw it, and her own lungs responded instantly, releasing a breath she had not known she had been holding since she descended the embankment. Small and shallow, the movement, a barely perceptible rise and fall that required her to fix her eyes on it and watch through several repetitions before she trusted herself that she was actually seeing it and not manufacturing it out of desperation. But it was there, unmistakable once seen. The irreducible, precious evidence of a body still doing the fundamental thing. "She's breathing," Dawn said into the phone. "She's breathing, I can see it." "That's very good," the dispatcher said, and the warmth that moved through those 3 words was brief but real, a crack of human feeling in the professional surface. You're doing so well. Don't try to move her. Can you tell me if she's bleeding anywhere you can see?" Dawn looked carefully. There was dried blood on the side of the woman's face, a darkened line that ran from her hairline down toward her jaw and had dried there hours ago, long enough ago that it had gone rust brown and lost its urgency, evidence of something that had happened and stopped. Her jacket sleeve was torn, and beneath the tear the skin looked abraded, raw, but nothing active, nothing that suggested a clock running down in the immediate, urgent way Dawn had been afraid of. She reported this to the dispatcher, who confirmed that help was 12 minutes away. 12 minutes. Dawn lowered herself to the ground beside the woman, not crouching, sitting, properly, cross-legged in the cold earth of the hollow floor, with the damp seeping immediately through her pink clothes, because 12 minutes was not a time for hovering at the edge of the situation. It was a time for being inside it, fully present, the way the puppy had been fully present since the beginning, unconditionally, without reservation, without the self-protective instinct to maintain a careful distance from the thing that needed you. She reached out and placed her hand on the woman's extended hand. Gently, the skin was cold, much colder than Dawn's own, and the contact made something move through her that was equal parts sorrow and resolution. "Someone's here," she said quietly, not into the phone, to the woman. "You're not alone, help is coming." The woman did not respond. Her breathing continued its small, shallow rhythm, unchanged. But the puppy, pressed against the woman's wrist on the other side, lifted its head at the sound of Dawn's voice and regarded her across the still body between them with those dark, exhausted eyes. Dawn had spent the last hour learning to read those eyes. She read them now. What she saw in them was not relief, not yet, not fully, because the puppy was too intelligent a creature to relax into relief before the danger was genuinely resolved, but something adjacent to relief, something like the easing of a pressure that had been sustained at enormous cost, the first softening of an effort held at maximum intensity for too long. The expression of an animal that had done the thing it had set out to do, and was now, for the first time since this afternoon began, not alone in the doing of it. It had been alone with this since the beginning, since whatever had happened on this slope had happened, and it had found itself the sole witness, the sole guardian, the sole hope, a creature weeks old, barely larger than a grown human's hand, sitting in a darkening forest beside the person it loved most in the world and making the calculation, in whatever way animals made such calculations, that sitting and waiting was not enough, that it had to go out, that it had to find someone, that it had to take the risk of leaving the side of the person it loved in order to save them, which was possibly the hardest thing love ever asked of anyone. Dawn thought about that, about going out into an unfamiliar world and choosing a stranger and pressing everything you had into the project of making that stranger understand. 12 minutes felt, in this hollow, in this failing light, next to this breathing woman and this exhausted puppy, like both an eternity and not very long at all. She kept her hand on the woman's cold fingers, and she talked, quietly, continuously, about nothing in particular, about the trail and the afternoon, and the way the light had looked coming through the oak leaves when she first set out, because the dispatcher had told her that hearing a voice sometimes helped, and because silence in this hollow felt like something that should not be allowed to settle again now that it had been broken. The puppy pressed closer to the woman's wrist and did not move. And somewhere above the canopy, growing from a distant murmur into something real and directional and closing, came the sound that Dawn had been listening for since the moment she pressed the emergency button on a shattered phone with 3% battery in a dark forest far off any marked path. She tilted her head back. Through the gap in the canopy, she could see the sky had gone fully grey now, the day completely spent. But the sound was getting louder. The sound became light before it became people. That was how Dawn would remember it afterward, the way the beams from the search torches arrived first, sweeping through the canopy above the hollow in long, swinging arcs that turned the bare branches into moving shadows and made the whole forest feel briefly, disoriently alive. She had been sitting in near darkness for long enough that the light, when it came, made her eyes water and her breath catch, and for a suspended moment she couldn't tell whether she was seeing rescue or dreaming it, whether the cold and the fear and the vigil in the dark had finally tipped her over into something her exhausted mind had manufactured to protect itself. Then she heard voices, real ones, with urgency and direction and the specific, clipped vocabulary of people trained to move fast through difficult terrain toward people who needed them. "Down here," Dawn called, then louder because her voice had come out thin and strange in the cold air. "Down here, in the hollow, there's a slope." The torches swung toward her. What followed happened with a speed and organization that stood in complete contrast to the long, slow, effortful work of the preceding hours. They came down the embankment with equipment Dawn had no names for yet: a stretcher, a cervical collar, a medical bag that a woman in a high-visibility jacket set open on the ground with practiced efficiency, while her colleague crouched beside the woman and began his assessment with quiet, methodical calm. There were 4 of them in total. One knelt beside Dawn almost immediately, a young man with a torch strapped to his forehead who asked her name and whether she was hurt and whether she had moved the woman at any point, and listened to her answers with his full attention in the way that adults very rarely listen to 7-year-olds, which in any other circumstances would have felt remarkable, but right now simply felt like the correct order of things. Dawn told him everything: the puppy, the trail, the cloth, the bag, the phone. She told it quickly and in order, the way she had been organizing it in her mind during the vigil, and he listened and nodded and relayed pieces of it through a radio on his shoulder to someone she couldn't see. The puppy had not moved from the woman's side. This was the thing that the rescuers had to navigate around rather than through, the small, immovable fact of the puppy's loyalty. When the medic gently but necessarily shifted the woman's extended arm to take her pulse, the puppy pressed closer rather than retreating, its body a steady, warm parenthesis against the woman's wrist, and nobody tried to remove it. Nobody suggested it should be elsewhere. The woman in the high-visibility jacket actually adjusted her position to work around it, which struck Dawn, watching from 2 feet away, as the most quietly decent thing she had witnessed all afternoon. They worked on the woman for several minutes, checking, stabilizing, communicating with each other, and with voices on the radio in a language of abbreviations and numbers that Dawn absorbed without understanding. Then came the careful, coordinated work of moving her onto the stretcher, which required all 4 of them, and proceeded with a deliberateness that spoke of training rather than hurry, even though Dawn could feel the urgency beneath it, the awareness of temperature and time that every movement was calibrated against. It was in this moment, the woman halfway lifted, the stretcher taking her weight, the shift from ground to carry, that it happened. The woman's eyes opened. Not fully, not with the sudden clarity of someone waking from ordinary sleep. They opened partially, the way eyes opened when consciousness was present, but only just, when the brain was receiving information, but processing it from a very long distance. She looked upward at the torches and the faces around her with an expression that was equal parts confusion and recognition, the look of someone who had been somewhere else entirely and was making the difficult, painful journey back. Her lips moved. One of the medics leaned down immediately. "You're safe," he said, low and clear. "We've got you. You're going to be okay." The woman's lips moved again. The sound that came out was barely a sound at all, a breath with shape, a whisper that required everyone in the hollow to go completely still in order to receive it. Dawn heard it. 2 syllables, soft and worn with love and relief, and the kind of exhaustion that went deeper than physical. Not a question, not a cry, just a name offered to the cold air of the hollow like a prayer, like the most important word in any language. Bibble. The puppy heard it too. What happened in the animal in that moment was not subtle and did not try to be. The careful composure it had maintained through the whole terrible afternoon, through the casting in the silent clearing, through the vigil in the dark, through the controlled, urgent purposefulness that had guided it every step of the way from an empty trail to this hollow, dissolved entirely. It made a sound that was nothing like a bark and nothing like a whimper, but was absolutely, unmistakably, the sound of a living creature, hearing the voice it had been working toward for hours, the voice it had organized its entire afternoon around the project of reaching again. It pressed its face against the woman's hand where it rested on the stretcher's edge, and its whole body shook, not the trembling of fear or cold, but something different, the release of a sustained and terrible tension finally given permission to let go. Dawn pressed her fist against her mouth. The medic closest to her glanced over, and his expression, in the torchlight, was not the neutral professional face he had been wearing since he arrived. Something had moved through it, something he perhaps had not entirely expected when he descended into this hollow tonight. He looked at Dawn, he looked at the puppy, he looked back at the woman on the stretcher, whose hand had found the puppy's head with the automatic, searching certainty of someone reaching for the thing most familiar to them in the world. Then he looked at Dawn again. "You found her," he said. "Pip found me," Dawn said. He held her gaze for a moment with an expression she would spend years finding language for. Then he nodded once, slowly, as though something had been confirmed for him that he had long suspected, but rarely witnessed this cleanly. There is a particular kind of courage that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with size or strength or the knowledge of its own capability. It arrives small and frightened and fully aware of everything it is not, and it moves forward anyway because the love driving it is larger than the fear surrounding it. Pip weighed perhaps 3 pounds. Pip had no map, no training, no way of knowing whether any of this would work. Pip had only the knowledge that the person it loved needed help, and the refusal, absolute, inarguable, sustaining, to let that need go unanswered. That is not instinct. That is courage in its purest form, the choice made in the absence of any guarantee to keep going. The world is full of Pips. They are the ones we overlook because they are small, because they are quiet, because they do not look like heroes from a distance. Look closer. They are always moving towards someone who needs them. Always, and if you are very lucky, if you are the kind of person who stops and crouches down and really looks, they will find you too. If this story has moved you today, please subscribe right now and join the thousands who show up for these stories every single day. We are chasing 1,000 subscribers this month, and we are so close. Your click is not a small thing to us. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to believe in something good today, and tell us in the comments, what is the bravest small thing you have ever witnessed? We read every one. Now come back, because the night is not over yet, and Dawn and Pip are not finished. They brought the woman out of the hollow on the stretcher, the 4 rescuers taking the embankment in careful stages, and Dawn climbed out beside them with the young medic's hand steadying her elbow on the steepest section. The forest looked different coming back through it, not less dark. The light had gone entirely now, and the torches were doing all the work, but less hostile, less indifferent. The same branches that had snagged her clothes on the way imparted for the stretcher with something that felt, in her current state, almost like cooperation. Pip walked beside the stretcher the entire way out. Not in front, not casting ahead or stopping and waiting. Beside, close to the wheel of the left stretcher handle, matching pace with the rescuers, its eyes moving between the woman's face and the path ahead with the attentiveness of an escort rather than a follower. It had done its running. It had done its searching and leading and desperate, solitary navigation of a world too large for something its size. That part was finished. Now it simply walked beside the person it had refused to abandon, which was a different kind of faithfulness, but no less absolute. Dawn watched it and felt something she had no word for at 7, but would later recognize as the specific quality of wonder reserved for things that restored your faith in the fundamental goodness of being alive. Not happiness, exactly. Deeper than happiness. Wider, the feeling of having seen something true. The ambulance was waiting at the trail's edge, its lights turning the tree trunks red and white in slow rotation. The paramedics who had been staged there took the stretcher with efficient, practiced hands, and the woman was lifted in, and someone in authority was telling Dawn that her mother had been called and was on her way, and a blanket appeared around her shoulders that she had not known she needed until it was there. She stood at the tree line and watched the ambulance prepare to leave. And then the rear door opened again, and the young medic leaned out. "Does the dog have somewhere to go tonight?" he asked. Dawn looked down at Pip, who was sitting on her foot. Precisely on her foot, its full weight committed to the contact, looking up at her with those dark, ancient, exhausted eyes. She looked back at the medic. "Yes," she said. Dawn's mother arrived 7 minutes after the ambulance left. She came down the trail at something between a walk and a run, her coat half-buttoned, her phone still in her hand, and when her torchlight found Dawn standing at the tree line in a blanket with a puppy on her foot, she made a sound that Dawn had never heard from her before, a short, compressed sound that contained an entire landscape of emotion in a single syllable, and covered the remaining distance in 4 fast strides, and gathered her daughter into both arms so completely that the blanket crumpled between them, and Pip had to step off Dawn's foot to avoid being folded into the embrace. Dawn pressed her face into her mother's shoulder and stayed there. She had not cried yet, not once during the whole of the afternoon, not at the embankment, not during the vigil, not when the woman's lips had formed Pip's name in that barely there whisper. She had been too busy, too focused, too engaged in the continuous forward motion of a situation that had not allowed her the space to feel anything fully until the feeling had accumulated beyond what forward motion could contain. But now, with her mother's arms around her and the ambulance gone, and the rescuers dispersing through the trees with their torches and their equipment, the forward motion stopped, and everything that had been traveling alongside it, kept at arm's length by the simple necessity of the next step and the next decision, arrived all at once. She cried in the way that children cried when they had been very brave for a very long time, not with the sharp, immediate release of ordinary childhood tears, but with a depth and a duration that surprised her own body, as though she were draining something that had been filling since the moment Pip first appeared on the trail and had not had a single opportunity to empty until now. Her mother held her and said nothing, which was exactly right. Pip sat on the ground beside them and waited with the patient, steady presence it had been demonstrating all afternoon, as though it understood that this too was part of the process, that the humans needed their own version of the release it had experienced in the hollow when the woman's voice said its name, and that the appropriate response was simply to be there while it happened. When the tears finally ran out, Dawn pulled back and looked at her mother's face in the torchlight. Her mother was crying too, she noticed. Quietly, in the contained way adults cried when they were trying not to, the tears moving down her face without her permission, while her expression attempted a composure that her eyes entirely undermined. "You could have," her mother began. "I know," Dawn said. Her mother looked at her for a long moment, really looked, the way people looked at someone they thought they knew completely and had just discovered additional dimensions in. Then she looked down at Pip, who looked back at her with its dark, serious eyes from its position on the cold ground. "This is Pip," Dawn said. Her mother crouched down, extended her hand. Pip sniffed it with the quick, businesslike efficiency of an animal that had moved past the phase of its life where it had time for extensive social formalities, then pressed the side of its head briefly against her palm, in the same gesture it had pressed against Dawn's knee on the trail what felt like a lifetime ago. Dawn's mother made a different sound this time, softer. "Hello, Pip," she said quietly. They walked back along the trail in the dark, Dawn's mother's arm around her shoulders, Pip moving at Dawn's heel with the quiet fidelity of an animal that had decided, somewhere between the hollow and the tree line, that this was where it belonged for the time being. The torches the rescuers had left lit at intervals along the path threw warm pools of light across the dirt, and in those pools Dawn could see her own footprints from the outward journey, small sneaker treads pointing away from home, toward the woods, toward whatever the afternoon had been asking of her. She looked at them and thought about the version of herself that had made those prints, the version standing at the trail's edge staring down at a trembling puppy and calculating the cost of following it, the version that had nearly turned back twice, the version that had not known, could not have known, that she was the only option. Not the best option, not the most equipped or the most capable, but the only one, the single human being positioned at that particular intersection of path and chance and willingness, on that particular afternoon, the one Pip had found after searching whatever territory its small legs had covered looking for a face that would stop and crouch and really see. This was the thing that had settled in her chest during the long wait in the hollow and had not left since. Not pride, she was too young and too honest for the uncomplicated version of pride, but something more complicated and more durable. The understanding that her presence in the right place at the right moment had not been an accident but had been made by the decision to follow rather than retreat, made by the choice, 3 separate times on 3 separate thresholds, to stay rather than leave. None of those choices had felt significant in the moment of their making. They had felt frightening, uncertain, costly in small but real ways. They had felt like the kind of choices that could easily have gone the other way. But they hadn't, and a woman was alive because they hadn't. A week later, Dawn's mother took her to the hospital. The woman, whose name was Nora, which Dawn learned from the nurse at the desk, was sitting up in bed when they arrived, her shoulder in a brace and a healing line along her jaw where the cut had been cleaned and closed. She looked different from the photograph on the broken phone. Less luminous, still carrying the weight of what had happened in the hollows of her eyes and the deliberate way she held herself, as though her body was reminding her constantly of its recent fragility. But her eyes were clear, and when the door opened and Dawn stepped in ahead of her mother, those eyes went wide and bright and filled immediately in a way that required no explanation. Pip was in Nora's lap. The rescue coordinator had arranged it, a special exception to the hospital's standard policy, approved by 3 different administrators who had all, apparently, heard enough of the story to find the exception non-negotiable. Pip looked up when Dawn entered, and its tail moved for the first time with the uncomplicated, unguarded joy of an animal that had put down its burden and was simply glad. Simply, fully, cleanly glad, without the weight of mission or the press of urgency, the tail moving back and forth with the easy rhythm of a creature finally, completely at rest. Nora reached out her unbandaged hand toward Dawn, and Dawn crossed the room and took it, and for a moment neither of them said anything because the thing between them was not the kind of thing that language arrived at quickly. "She told me," Nora said finally, her voice still carrying a roughness that would take more time to resolve. "The paramedic, he told me what you did." She paused. "How old are you?" 7, Dawn said. Nora looked at her with an expression that moved through several registers before settling into something clear and permanent. 7, she repeated, as though she were filing the number somewhere important, somewhere it would not be misplaced. She looked down at Pip, who was looking up at both of them with those ancient, knowing eyes. "I sent him out," she said quietly, "when I realized I couldn't move, I couldn't reach my bag, I couldn't call out loud enough, so I tore a piece of my sleeve and I tied it around his neck, and I told him to go find someone." She stopped, steadied herself. "I didn't actually think," another pause. "He'd never done anything like that before. He was only 12 weeks old." Dawn looked at Pip. 12 weeks, smaller than her shoe. No training, no map, no guarantee. Just the instruction of someone it loved and the refusal, the absolute, sustaining, copper-bottomed refusal, to let that be the end of the story. The tears came again, differently this time. Not the draining release of the tree line, but something quieter. Gratitude, maybe, or the particular grief of understanding, fully and for the first time, exactly how close it had all come to going the other way. She reached out and placed her free hand on Pip's small, warm head. Pip leaned into it and closed its eyes. And Dawn understood, in the way that certain truths arrived not as thoughts, but as the sudden, settled certainty of something that had always been true and had simply been waiting for the right moment to become visible. That Pip had not chosen her because she was strong or brave or equipped. It had chosen her because she was there. And she had chosen to stay because something in her recognized that being there, truly there, present and willing and refusing to look away, was not a small thing. It was, in fact, everything.